So this past week I did something that I don't often do. I have recently spent a fair bit of money on lenses and a new camera body. I don't normally like to spend too much money on gear, otherwise you become too over-reliant on it. But I had a spare camera body that was well beyond its expiration date, and I was changing over from the 85mm 1.2 version 2L lens to the 85mm 1.4 IS, the newer Canon 85mm L lens, which means I had the old 85mm and a 5D Mark IV body that was about 140,000 actuations past its shutter life, and I needed something to do with it. I don't really have major holes within my gear arsenal, as it were, that I needed to fill, so it was more a case of thinking, you know, what recreationally would I want to get for those items, and is there anything that I wish I had for anything I have coming up, or something I wish I had generally on me the rest of the time. And I had a look at what I had and what I had coming up. The first is the Sigma 150-600 contemporary super telephoto zoom lens, and the reason I picked that up, I'm not really a fan of zooms, as it were, but I decided that I wanted something to take with me to Banff when me and my wife head out there in November. Decently compact for the focal range that you get from it. The image quality is going to be good enough for what I want it to do. It's more of a fun holiday than it is a photography holiday, so that'll be fantastic. And with the money I had left over, I was sort of thinking, well, you know, do I want more lenses? I don't really need any more lenses. I'm pretty happy. I considered something like a tilt shift, but I wouldn't get the use out of it that I'd want considering the outlay. So I had a bit of a brainstorm about what I wanted, and really I was looking through the pictures that me and my wife have been printing and putting up around the house, and I realised that a significant amount of them are coming off of phones. Despite the fact that we have all of these fantastic cameras, a significant amount of images that we are printing for at home is coming off of either mine or my wife's phone. And they're not bad, but they're also not particularly good. My wife has an iPhone XR, I think it is, and I'm using an old iPhone 7 S Plus or Plus S or S Plus, whatever it is. And as far as it goes, the cameras on there are definitely usable. They're not bad, but for what I wanted to have around the house in prints and whatnot, they're not quite good enough in my opinion. So considering that I've been a Canon user for coming up, I think 5 or 6 years now, and we also have the Sony A7R3, which is my wife's wedding camera, I realized that essentially if I wanted to have a photo of our new dog, or when we go out to a family event, or if we go on a short break somewhere or anything like that, I've either got to take out a huge DSLR, a significantly large Sony A7R3 with massive files, or I've got to use my phone where I don't think the picture quality is quite good enough. So I decided that I was going to get like a stopgap camera, something that fills in between the need for the huge cameras and the phone, something in the middle of the two. And I considered getting the Fujifilm X-T2, which I actually owned a couple of years ago. I bought it before we took a trip to San Francisco, which was comfortably the worst holiday I've ever been on. Almost definitely the worst holiday I've ever been on. I had food poisoning. San Francisco is horrendous. It was just not a good trip. And I had the X-T2 with me, and whilst it performed very well, it's a fantastic camera in use. I don't think there's been a company understand the importance of making a camera fun to use quite like Fuji has. The reason I bought the X-T2 was to fill in as a side-by-side with the Canon, and the image quality just wasn't there, the dynamic range just wasn't there, and the sharpness just wasn't there. And in the end, we got rid of the X-T2 and went down the Sony route once they finally got all their ducks in a row with multiple cards and a joystick to change focus and things like that. We got rid of the X-T2, and whilst it was an absolute blast to use it, it was just not quite what I wanted for the purpose I had at that point. However, this is a new purpose. This is just a camera to have lying around that we can chuck in a handbag or in a pocket or whatever, take with us when we take the dog for a walk or when we go and see family and so on. And it will still give us better image quality than the phones are giving us, but without the impracticality of bringing along the 5D Mark IV or the Sony. So I thought about the X-T2 again. It would definitely fill that job more than adequately, and I went out with the intention of actually picking up an X-T2. The reason an X-T2 not an X-T3 is because it's just not worth the additional outlay there. The X-T3 does appear to be a far superior camera, but that's beside the point. So I went out to have a look and pick up an X-T2 and potentially a 23mm and something like a 50mm. Obviously it's a crop camera, so those are 35 and about 75-80mm, something like that, and was on the fence about actually pulling the trigger, and decided in the end actually to pick up one of these. This is actually the Fuji X100F, and whilst it's obviously a very expensive camera for what it is, it did something that the X-T2 didn't do. In fact, something that almost no other camera I looked at did do. I was at one point considering one of the sort of the A6500, A6000. So there's so many numbers there, I don't really know which one's which, and they've started going down as well as up with the numbers, so it's all very confusing, so I need to sort that out. But I considered going with the smaller Sonys. I considered going, like I say, with the X-T2, and I even had a brief look at Olympus and Lumix. And the reason that I actually decided that this would be the best thing is because it completely restricts me. What I don't want to have is another system that I have to have a separate bag packed for. I have to have lots of batteries, lots of lenses, lots of messing about. I actually just wanted something that completely restricted me. And it actually relates to a point I made a few years ago on a workshop I was teaching about getting yourselves into wedding photography. And I said that there's a really easy tip to pretty much make anybody a better photographer. And it's to put a 35mm on your camera and not take it off. Now, if you're shooting with a crop camera, it needs to be an equivalent, so 23mm, 24mm, in that ballpark, but essentially the equivalent of a 35mm lens on your camera. And the reason that that will make you a better photographer is because it's wide enough that you have to contextualize the photos that you're taking. You have to consider the entire frame. You can't just blow out backgrounds and focus in on one thing, which is actually fairly easy to do as a photographer. It's one of those things that I think people outside of photography don't realize how easy it is to look like a professional photographer, or what the idea of a professional photographer is, by simply blowing out backgrounds and isolating a subject. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing that, but you have to have more. You have to have composition. You have to have an understanding of the narrative of your image. You have to understand the way people are going to read it. You've got to understand all of the rules and whether or not you're going to break them. It's not just a case of like, here's a thing, I'll blow out the background, therefore it's a good photo. You have to understand the light and the composition and so on. And the Fuji X100F has a 23mm, which is a 35mm equivalent lens on it. It's an f2. Because it's crop, it's not particularly good at blowing out backgrounds. It's okay, but you still get a pretty decent idea of everything that's going on in the frame. So what I'm actually doing is I've taken a camera that I was going to get solely for the purpose of photographing our dog or family events and so on, and I've actually bought a tool that should, if my theory is correct, make me a better photographer. Because having that fixed, unchangeable 35mm equivalent lens is going to make me work harder as a photographer to get better pictures of the things that matter the most to me. And as photographers, we really should always be trying to find ways to improve. This is not going to be in my wedding bag. It's not going to be used on portrait shoots, unless it's an experiment to see how it handles that kind of situation. But it's not there for that reason. This is solely to go in my pocket or in my wife's handbag when we go out with the dog or whatever. But at the same time, I'm hoping that this will be subliminally training me to be a better photographer. Now, just to give a little rundown of the actual camera, it's really well built. I have to say, like, I'm massively impressed. I'm not often impressed with the build quality of a lot of cameras. As long as you have 4K or full frame written on the box, it doesn't seem to matter too much about the build quality in a lot of cases. But this is really, really well built. Really nice, solid construction. The layout's pretty straightforward. I'm not a big fan of having the memory card in with the battery, but it's not the end of the world. It's just one SD card, so it couldn't be used for anything of any real professional nature because you've got no redundancy. The usability is as good, if not better, than the X-T2, which I had. I absolutely love the look of it. Everyone always talks about the looks of these cameras. They look fantastic. It has the optical and electronic viewfinder. I only use the electronic because I can't really understand the point of the optical if you've got the electronic in there. The film simulations in it are fantastic. I do shoot with it in RAW, but I'm probably not going to. I'm considering really just using it as a JPEG camera so I can just transfer things straight out. A couple of things I'm madly in love with. It has a lot of custom function buttons, which means that I can sort of set this up to work entirely off of muscle memory rather than having to cycle through menu systems, which drives me absolutely mad. And the second thing that I'm over the moon that they've added is the joystick, which I use to change the focus points. That's a real deal breaker for me because I'm not a fan of D-pads at all when it comes to changing focus points. So yeah, I'll probably be one of the only people on YouTube that puts up a video discussing this camera that hasn't been either paid by Fuji to talk about it in a nice way or given one by Fuji to talk about it in a nice way. I paid with my own money, and my opinions are very much my own. As I say, I just want to reiterate, this is not something that I feel could be a professional camera for the work that I do by any stretch of the imagination. I might be enticed into trying it out at a wedding to just see if I can get some candids with it, see if the look of the camera being a bit more inconspicuous allows me to get better candids, but I don't think it will. The image quality is more than good enough for what I need it for. It needs to fill that gap between a phone and my DSLR. It's a really cool camera. I'm really happy with it. And the fact is, the reason I went for this over the X-T2, which I could have got for roughly the same money with everything that I wanted, would be that this restricts me, which is going to make me a better photographer. Restriction almost always will make you a better photographer. Always having access to gear, always having access to more and more stuff and changing lenses and changing camera bodies and so on and so forth, all that does is distracts you, whereas the restriction is going to be the thing that improves the way you think as a photographer. So that's pretty much all for this video. One last side note, I absolutely hate the lens cap. It's stupid. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a great day and a great week and a great month. Bye.